Hey everyone. So to carry on from some of the sessions that we've been doing in regards to Microsoft Azure and what Veeam can do there. So we kicked off the week with the new product Veeam Backup for Microsoft Azure, which is how we natively protect those workloads in Microsoft Azure. Then we touched on direct restore to Azure. And what that allows us to do is take any of our Veeam image-based backups and convert them into Azure VMs that could then either be used for different scenarios, whether it's disaster recovery or potentially data recovery, test and dev, or just migration, like if you're looking to move some of those workloads into the cloud. But during that process, I kind of touched on something that I wanted to come back and talk a little bit more about, and that is in particular the Azure Proxy. So when you add in your Azure accounts, whether that's the compute or whether it's a storage account for Azure, so as you can see here, I've got a storage account and a compute. When you add that compute account, that enables another option to add another type of proxy, which is an Azure proxy. What that proxy allows us to do is upload the data or the backups into that proxy to then be converted there instead of on premises, because ultimately what that does is if you've got a poor connection to Microsoft Azure, or you've got bandwidth issues that don't allow you to get that data up as quick, then it might be that you want to leverage that Azure proxy. But that got me thinking about what today's video needs to touch on. But first of all, if I just touch on what some of the options are within that proxy. So now I don't have an issue with connectivity to Azure from my site, and I'm going to get into why and when you'd use this as well in a little bit more detail. But ultimately what we do is we hit that wizard, we start coming through here, we choose our name, we say how many concurrent tasks, and that will determine what or how many CPUs you have within that proxy when you provision that. So we give it a name, we then choose the credentials that we want to use for the local administrator account to sign into that Azure VM. So when it's actually an Azure VM that sits in your subscription, we choose our subscription, we choose our location. Obviously that location should be where you're going to be directly restoring that workload into. We then choose the size, what that should be, and how many, so what that size is and what storage account it will live in. So where does the VM disks actually reside? We then choose whether we want to create or use an existing resource group and give it a DNS label as well. Within there, we choose the network group or the virtual network and the subnet that we want that to use as well. Then it's simply an apply and finish. Now, I decided to run some tests against a very, very small workload, but this will give us, hopefully you can see the screen here as well. But so what is there, 9 tests I think in total, maybe not, maybe 8. So what I wanted to test is this same machine, which is actually a very tiny Windows IoT machine. Actually, I've used in quite a few demos, and it's 5.5 gig, it's 2.6 gig of data in total, and I wanted you to use that as my test bed. Now, simply because it won't take too long to run that conversion. So the idea is that I want to take it from these various different locations, and I want to use an Azure proxy, or I want to just use the local VBR server. So you can see here, the ones in red are probably not going to be very performant. So i.e., if we're going to use our capacity tier, so in this instance, this is a Microsoft Azure blob storage account where my backups are being tiered to from a copy point of view when it comes to our cloud tier capacity tier, and this is where I'm using the Azure proxy that we've just gone through from a wizard point of view. This is where we're using the local VBR. Then we get into, okay, so I've got a integrated dedupe appliance within my local site, which also contains that same virtual machine backup. And if I'm using the Azure Proxy, again, you can see that I've determined that this is one of the lowest, or it takes a bit longer to get that machine restored into Azure as a fully functional virtual machine. Then we get into, okay, from a dedupe machine, but using the local VBR, okay, we hit sub 10 minutes. So generally speaking, not bad, and we can definitely live with that in terms of getting that restore process in place. And then we get down to using the Azure Proxy again, but with local DAS. So you can start to see that now we're definitely sub 10 minutes using local DAS. But again, we seem to be penalized really because we're using the Azure Proxy on these restore efforts, because actually our link speed is better than normal, or it's above standard, which means we don't really need to have that Azure Proxy, because then as soon as you use the local, and we use the local direct attached storage repository again, we shave another 2 minutes off that. Now the interesting, and this was actually a question that came out of the last video on Twitter, was these two tests. So what I wanted to test was actually if the data in the capacity tier is already in Azure Blob Storage, then I believe what we're doing is having to bring back this data, or some of this data that we don't have potentially on premises, to then send up into Azure as the virtual machine conversion happens. So I decided actually to go and deploy an Azure Veeam Backup Replication server as an Azure VM and configure it myself. There is something in the Azure marketplace that allows you to roll your own. I just wanted to make sure I was using the latest version 10 software, so I went and built my own. In fact, I just used Community Edition because that gives us the ability to unlock that and allow us to restore, and I'll try and get to that and show you what that looks like as well. But you can see if I use the Azure Proxy, so now all of our data is in Azure, whether it's the proxies in Azure, the VBRs in Azure, as well as the capacity tier leveraging Microsoft Azure Blob Storage. That actually takes longer than any of the other options. But what is interesting is if we use that local VBR server, which again is in Azure, we leverage that capacity tier. Well, now we've shaved off, like pretty much halved our time. And all we've done is we've spun up a simple Veeam Backup Replication server within Azure to perform that recovery task. Ideal scenario there is, well, if we've got a failure scenario on premises, and maybe not a full disaster, but let's say half of our ASXi hosts have died, or some of our physical infrastructure has stopped working, it might be that we need to get some certain workloads back up and running in a good location. Well, we could leverage this Azure VBR server that we may have powered off, ready to go, or potentially we have it scripted and automated to spin up these machines. So what I want to do with the rest of the video is actually go and have a look at what that VBR server looks like, and it doesn't even have to contain your license per se. And if you're not actually performing the backups, the Community Edition gives you full flexibility on restorations as well. So if we jump out of Excel spreadsheet, who thought you'd be seeing an Excel spreadsheet as part of a Veeam demo? So if I jump into this machine, and don't worry, that public IP will be gone by the time you see this video. So within here, I've installed. So this is a 2019 machine, and I've installed Veeam Backup Replication, and it's just sat there with Community Edition, no license file added at all. Now, whilst that's logging in, I'm going to jump back over to my on-premises, because one of the key parts to this is we ultimately want to add in our Azure Blob Storage. So what I need to do there is I need to make sure that when you're adding this to your new Community Edition, that name needs to be exactly the same. So I'm going to quickly copy that, and hopefully we can actually add that. So again, this could all be automated. Everything could be added via PowerShell. In fact, Anthony's done some pretty cool PowerShell scripts that allow us to achieve what we need to. So yeah, you can see that it's a Community Edition version of Veeam Backup Replication. You can have a look under inventory. I have nothing added. Backup infrastructure, I also have nothing added but itself. And again, if we wanted to add that proxy, although we've just proven that that's probably not the best idea because we're just going to use our Veeam Backup Replication server if we're ever restoring anything from Azure to Azure. But what we do need to do is add that object storage repository. So if we choose object storage, we choose Microsoft Azure Blob Storage, we choose that blob storage. This is where we need that name to be exactly the same. Now I've already added my storage account details into this. So we choose the container, so it's cloud tier. We then go and choose the folder. We could limit a consumption there if we really wanted to, if it was not being used by anything else. And bearing in mind, this is not going to affect anything that I'm also doing on premises with this. So if I run this import backups, it's going to say importing the backup jobs may take a while. Now I know there's not that much in here, so it shouldn't take too long. So what this is going to do, so we've added our backup repository, we've added that object storage, that blob storage. And now we're going to run that rescan against that, and we're going to sync this into the... So we've found the one repository, and now we're going to synchronize the disks or the backups that are part of that cloud tier that we've been sending up for a couple of weeks. So the scenario here is, let's say some of the site or all of the site is now down, and we need somewhere to bring up these workloads. This is a prime example of what we could do with those backups. Now they've been copied from our primary backup storage, that is our scale-out backup repository, and then we're using the capacity tier to copy that directly. So it lands in the scale-out backup repository, and then it's instantly copied to the object storage, or the Microsoft Azure Blob storage in this instance. So then if I go over to home, you'll now see these imported machines and jobs. So now we've got our machines, and from here we can go restore to Microsoft Azure, and this is the one that takes that 5 minutes. So again, you run through that process. It's going to use its same settings, etc. Now I'm not going to run through that job, but that should give you an idea of some of the use cases and the scenarios where you could potentially use the direct restore to Microsoft Azure function. This same process will work the same in AWS. I actually have a similar situation or similar setup in AWS, where I have a VBR server sat up there that's actually powered off, the same as this one normally is already powered off, and it just enables me to quickly spin up so that I can perform this direct recovery or this direct restore, just in case I need copies of data that are inaccessible from a on-premises point of view. I think with that we'll finish up there. But yeah, so ultimately we can add in any of those object storage. We can still perform any of the guest file level recovery, things like guest file application recovery. If it was that, we can push it to AWS. Obviously that wouldn't cost you some egress charges there, but the flexibility is that, well, we've not had to install any paid for license here because we're not protecting any new data, but also it gives us the full functionality in terms of being able to restore those workloads back into the business. Now, one thing I will mention is around, there's two different modes, and maybe there's a video on this as well. When it comes to our scale-out backup repository and our capacity tier, there's two options there, which one is move mode, which is what came with 9.5 update 4, and that is going to tier off backups as they age out of the primary backup storage retention period and tier off into object storage. But then you've also got copy mode, which came in version 10. So as soon as that copy or that backup lands in that scale-out backup repository, it gets copied up into the object storage. Now both will work, just bear in mind that if it's a move function or a move mode that you're using, then the copy of this data that you see in here will be maybe older because it's being tiered off. But yeah, any questions, then drop me a line on Twitter or in the comments below. Yeah, and I'll be back tomorrow to probably talk a little bit more about cloud tier, and in particular about the Azure Blob storage and how we can leverage that alongside this. So we've spoken about cloud native backups with our Veeam Backup for Microsoft Azure, and how we can natively protect those Azure IaaS workloads in an agentless fashion. We've spoken about how we can take your image-based backups from on-premises and push them into Microsoft Azure. And now the next thing that we need to talk about is, well, how do we get that data, or how could we leverage the public cloud to store for either long-term retention or just to have an off-site copy of our data. So that's what we'll get into next. Thanks for watching. Any questions, drop them in the notes below or find me on Twitter @MichaelCade1. Awesome stuff. Cheers, guys.